Welcome to this next installment on the nowRail model railway control system, and today we're going to be looking at some new features that have come in on version 1.01 as it is now, and that is MP3 player control. Now, the world is not a silent place, and railways certainly aren't silent. Now, quite often, obviously with model railways, people think about putting sound decoders in the locos, but what I was interested in is background sound. So this is my wagon works on my layout, and from the moment I started to sort of build this item up, one of the things I wanted was sound. So inside the shed is this wagon, and as you can see, just inside that wagon there is a speaker, and one of the goals for the layout was that as the layout is running, you will hear the guys working inside the shed. Now, one of the other places that I've placed a speaker is inside this water tower at the front of the layout, because again, I didn't just want one set of sounds playing, I wanted the ability to have multiple sounds all coming out at the same time, just as happens in the real world. Now, coming down to the other end of the layout, this is another area that I'm about to put sound in, and this area here is going to be a sheep cattle dock. This is obviously where they unload the animals, and the goal here is to put an RDF sensor in here to read sort of RDF tags, so that when the wagon pulls in, if there are sheep in the wagon, it will play the sheep sounds, cow sounds, or pig sounds, depending which animal is in the wagon. So this is just a little project that I'm working on, and to be honest, it's starting to work really well. And I wanted the ability to do all of this within the nowRail system while keeping the lines of code down to an absolute minimum. And I think I've just about got that worked out, as you'll see. So let's get started, and I'm going to start by going over to the nowRail page on the Digital Town website, so you can start to see the components and the circuit that is required to build everything up. So on the nowRail page, just scroll down through the various headings until you come to, where is it, MP3 player functions. Now, the boards that are currently supported are from what I call the DY series. There are some more boards, there are some smaller boards, but the boards that I'm using at the moment, I do have some of the smaller boards on test, but I'm using these 10 to 20 watt boards and these 5 watt boards. Now, the code also works with this board. It's a JQ8900. It's about the same size as the old DF mini player, and to be honest, it's rubbish. So although it works with it, don't bother. Don't waste your money. I've bought two and they've both broken really quickly. So if you can get it to work, the code will work with it, but these boards are far, far better. Now, I buy these off AliExpress, as you can see, very, very cheap. £3.90 for the more powerful board. They come in two versions. You've got the one version that has the SD card, and then there is some built-in storage. So on the bigger black boards, these are the sort of 10 or 20 watt boards, they have 8 megabytes of inbuilt storage or an SD card, whereas if you come down to the 5 watt boards, I think it's only got 4 megabytes or obviously the SD card. Now, how much storage you require for your sound files really depends on the project you're building. So for my workshop, I am using one of these boards with the SD card because it is quite a lot of files, whereas for the cattle dock, I can get everything within 8 megabytes, so I'm using one of these boards instead. So coming back to the Digital Town website, let's have a quick look at how these are set up. Very, very simple to build. It literally is a serial, a UART connection. Now in nowRail, that connection is using serial 2. So you have to use a ESP32 that has serial 2 available. Now obviously the standard, what I call the ESP32, is it the room model or something, I use the 30-pin versions all the time. They have serial 2, so no problem there, and it's literally a case of connecting up the serial 2 pins and then also a busy pin. Now the way this works, it is possible to get feedback from these via the serial communication. I have not implemented that because those functions really don't need to be used for this sort of project. Instead, the way the boards work is that when no track is playing, there is a busy pin that goes high, and you just connect the busy pin to whichever pin you have free on your board. I've just used 15 on this one, but on one of the other boards I've got here, it's on a completely different pin. Now, going into the player itself, the 10 to 20 watt players have a 6 to 35 volt DC power supply. The smaller 5 watt versions just use 5 volts. So again, check which board you're on. I'll be honest, the 10 watt versions, the sound output is absolutely superb when you've got a decent speaker. So as you can see which sort of speakers you can use and what power output you're going to get. To download the files onto these, just plug in your micro USB and download them. It just becomes basically a USB drive. So very, very simple boards to use. Not too big, they're going to fit under the layout. Obviously they're not going to fit inside vehicles and stuff, but from my point of view, the only item that has to be above the layout is the speaker. So a very, very simple system. And just to be aware, although I've got this in the examples today connected to an ESP32 with nothing else connected, I could have connected these into the same ESP32 that is controlling the layout servos, the lighting and all the rest of it. The reason I didn't is that the board is already attached to the layout is running, and I didn't want to pull anything off and start rewiring stuff. So that's why I've built it as a standalone, but it's not using a lot of processor power, so you can just put it on an existing board if you wish. So that's the circuit. Let's get into the coding. So scrolling down, bizarrely, there are only 2 functions that I've included in nowRail at the moment. If some other things come up, I may add some more functions later, but at the moment it's doing everything I require. So the 2 functions are the volume, and the example of this would be mylayout.mp3 play volume, and the volume that I want. This is a value between 0 and 30, 0 being silent, 30 being the loudest. I think I've got mine set to 27 at the moment. The other function is this add MP3 play track, and this is a fairly simple function to use. You have the accessory number, and it says here this is the accessory number that you want to trigger the event, and the direction. So obviously on most DCC systems you sort of send either a 0 or a 1, sort of on or off. In nowRail, as you'll see later, there are other things that we can send. So I can send any value, which means I can send the volume as the volume I want it to be rather than just on or off. Then we've got the track number. Now, when you put the tracks onto these, there is a way to put them on. I have done a separate tutorial on using these players. They're on the Digital Town website, which gives examples of how to do them. But basically, you number your tracks 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, and then you just increment. There's no names. It's 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 2, 3 and onwards. And so when you want to call your track, you would just call track 2, track 3, whatever, and it will pick up the correct track. Now there is also a max track number. So if you were calling a single track, you just put your track number in there and probably put the same track number in the maximum track number. However, within nowRail, each, if you like, MP3 track that's added, you can add a range of tracks. So that means you could want, on this accessory number, I might want tracks sort of 1 to 6. On the next accessory, I might want 7 to 10. And I think it's then 11 to 12 I've got. This is just going from memory of what I did with my cattle dock that I've been testing. So if you like, I've got a set of cow sounds, sheep sounds, and pig sounds, and they're all set to a different accessory number. So when the appropriate trigger is sent, it plays a different type of sound. Finally, there is the mode. If it's set to 0, it will play a single track. So the track number will be played, and then that track will either will just stop, or if this is set to 1, it will continue to play all the tracks listed in a random mode. So we'll have a look at the random setting in a moment, but basically that means for my workshop, I think I've got 24 sounds on there, and it just plays through them at random with a random time gap in between. So those are the only 2 functions required to get all of this working. Now, just to give you an idea of what it all looks like in real life, obviously we have an ESP32 dev module, and that is connected to this 10-watt board. This is just up against a really cheap speaker for my testing. When I'm actually building the layouts, these are the speakers that I tend to use. I forget what I got them out of. I think it was an old TV or something. But anyway, they're really nice speakers, and I have plenty left. So I'm just using these cheap speakers for testing. So this is the 10-watt version. I've actually got an RFID reader over here because that's been working along with this, doing some testing. I'm also doing some testing here with an ESP32. I think this is a D1 mini board. These seem to work really well with nowRail, but I'm still testing. This is connected to the 5-watt version. As you can see, this is already mounted on a bit of perf board because this is ready to go. This is literally ready to plug into the layout. It's got all the sounds for the workshop sorted out. And then down here I've got I think it's a DY-HV8F C3 board or something. Anyway, I'm just testing this to see how it works, and I'm just using this as an on-off switch, as you'll see in a moment. The reason I'm sort of testing these boards here is it's just useful to keep trialing different boards. I've got a few more in my sort of workbox that I'm working through and just seeing which are any good and which are rubbish. So certainly the D1 Mini one is pretty good. The verdict is still out on the little DY-HV8. So coming over to the Arduino IDE, I've got a new version of nowRail version 1 that I saved with a different name. And the first thing to do is go to the nowRail user setup.h. Now, once you get in there, you'll see in the latest version that there is a definition for the serial pins. Now, on the ESP32 dev module, let's quickly go back to the webcam. This is a ESP32 dev module down on the bottom left. That by default seems to use pins 16 and 17 for the serial 2 connection, so those are absolutely ideal. Then the next thing that you need to do is uncomment this little section. Let's edit, uncomment, and we have the busy pin. Now, if you remember in the circuit diagram, this is the pin that is read by the ESP32 to work out if a track is playing or not playing, so it knows whether to play the next track. You can set this to whichever pin number is suitable for you. Obviously, if you've got other things on the board already, you know, in my case, if I'd got servos or something being run by the ESP32 or LEDs, buttons, whatever, I may not have pin 15 free, so just use whichever pin you wish to use. MP3 num tracks is the maximum number of MP3 functions. So if you like, the individual tracks or groups of tracks. Now I've set this at 20 by default. If you need more, set it to more. I've tended to find 20 is more than enough for my needs, but customize it to what you require. You then have two more variables, MP3 into val min and MP3 into val max. Now this is for when the tracks are playing at random. So when you play a set of random tracks, the nowRail will not only choose the next track at random, but the spacing between playing the tracks is also randomized between these two values. So in my case, I wanted the gap to be on this particular setup between 0.25 of a second and 10 seconds. I think on the workshop I've actually got it up to something like 20 seconds. So again, this is up to you to set this value at whatever works best for your layout. I'd probably set that maybe a little bit higher to 2000, but it's working fine, so it's staying as it is. Finally, you've got the MP3 volume, and this is the default volume that the MP3 player will start playing at. Now 27, certainly on the 10-watt board, is quite loud, so you may need to turn this volume down to whatever suits your layout. One of the things with background sounds, you don't want them in your face, so to speak. They are supposed to be a background sound rather than something that is absolutely shouting at you. Whereas there's other sounds that I've got where in that water tower, that will be things like a guard's whistle that will sound like it's coming out of the station. For those sounds, I will want a lot more volume because those are, if you like, not so much a background sound, but a foreground sound as the train is leaving. So again, set this volume as you want, and don't forget you can change the volume in real time while the layout is running. Now, once you've uncommented those lines, and for most people they'll probably leave them exactly as they are, nip back to the first screen, and this is where we enter our functions, and they literally go into the setup. So on the MP3 player that I'm using, and let's just go back to the webcam, this is going to be for this board here that is being driven off the ESP32 dev module. The way I've got this working is accessory 4000, when it receives a value of 1, will play track 2. Notice both tracks are track 2, and by putting a 0 in here, it means it's not going to repeatedly play it. It's literally going to play it once, and that's the end of it. Coming down to this next accessory, I've numbered it 4012. One thing on the accessory numbers, obviously in nowRail I can have much higher accessory numbers because I'm sort of not restricted by the DCC standards. If you are going to use the connection to your DCC controller, that's in a separate video, then obviously you will need to make these values probably below 2000, because most DCC controllers cannot send an accessory command above 2000. So this one, 4012, in this case, when it receives an instruction to play, which again is 1, it will play the tracks from 0 to 10 in a random order. So those are going to be my sheep sounds. The other one is my individual cow sound. Now I've put this function in here, mylayout.mp3 play volume, and I've set it to 27. That will override any value that is put in the setup. Obviously I put this in case someone forgets to set the volume in the layout. And then the other one that I've done is I have used the standard accessory command that nowRail has, and I'm immediately sending a command to send a value of 1 to accessory 4012. And because I've put this in the setup, as soon as the board is turned on, it will immediately trigger this function to run, and therefore my sheep sounds will automatically start playing. However, the cow will only sound if a button is pressed that sends a command of 4000. So that's the code as it's written. Let's have a look at it running. Now you'll notice in that video that the sheep sound was playing. When the button was pressed, the cow noise played, but as soon as the cow sound had ended, the sheep continued to then play. It's quite weird the way it works. It literally inserts that single track, but as soon as the cow sound track ends, it will just pick the next random track from out of the sheep stack of tracks, if that makes sense. The idea was that I could then call an individual sound, a bit like a whistle blowing or something, that would be a triggered one-off item, but then after that happens, I wanted the background sounds to continue as before. So that is, if you like, the version that I've got that is doing my random sheep. Now you'll notice that obviously I was pressing the button on that video, and that button was on that little WEACT ESP32, and this is the sketch that's running on there. Again, it's just a nowRail sketch, and the only thing that I actually added was this single line of code. And I did make a bit of a mistake. You'll notice I had to press twice. I should have actually put 2 ones in there, then it would always send a 1 rather than sending 1 the first time and 0 the second time. But this adds a standard pin button, so that is a button that is attached directly to the unit rather than to a shift register or something, and it was attached to pin 5. It sends the accessory command to accessory 4000, which, going back to our other sketch, 4000 was the cow. The first time the button's pressed, it sends a 1, which makes the cow moo. The second time, it sends a 0. If I put 1 and 1, it would always make the cow moo each time it was pressed. I just knocked this up as a test. But again, this line of code and the button, if I'd wanted, could have been added in the setup for those for the cattle ESP32. The way nowRail works, bizarrely, you can have the buttons on the same unit as the unit that's playing the sound or driving the servo. There's no difference between, if you like, a sender and a receiver. Every node can send and receive. So what you could do is, if you just wanted to build a quick sort of MP3 player on your layout and you didn't want to implement nowRail, you could literally just add some buttons into this code and just have a single ESP32 creating your tracks and being controlled by the buttons. It's up to you. So that is how the button was added. So that's the basics of how this unit is working. What we're now going to do is look at this one over here. Now this is the unit that's going into that workshop. So this is just going to play random workshop sounds, as you will now see, where you're going to get to listen to sandpaper. You might need to turn your volume up because it's not the loudest. So the goal, as you can see, is to have some background noises. I've got all sorts on there. There's electric drills, ratchets being tightened, sandpaper, wood being sawn, all the sort of sounds that you would hear within the workshop. So this is the sketch that, if you like, is literally going to be installed on the layout. And I'm just going to go through this because it's got a couple of extra features within it. So looking at the sketch, the first thing, we're just going to go back to the nowRail user setup.h. Now don't forget, this is a different board. This is using the D1 mini ESP-32. So again, I've got pins 16 and 17 for the serial. The big difference here is that the MP3 busy pin is now connected to pins 21, and you'll notice that I've changed the random intervals to between 2 seconds and 20 seconds. The reason for that is that it would be very unusual for one sound to be triggered very quickly after another. Usually there'll be a gap when someone's walking from one place to another. So if you like, he's not going to saw a piece of wood and then 0.25 of a second start drilling a hole in it. It's going to take him a few seconds to sort of walk to his drill and get started. So this has sort of given me the variation in sound timing that is about right for what I want to do. So that is the nowRail user setup.h. Now we've dealt with the user setup, let's go back to the main setup. And this is a very, very simple setup. So I've got one function, and it is number 4020 for my layout. The 4000 range of numbers I'm keeping for the sounds on the various boards. And this triggers when a 1 is sent, and it will play tracks 1 to 24 on the card, and it will play them in a random order. I've then set the volume to 27, and I've also put in a accessory command to start 4020 by sending it a 1, so that as soon as this board is fired up, the sounds will start playing in the workshop. It's as simple as that to get the sounds to run. So as you can see, sort of 3 lines of code, and you can set up your own background sound system. I did say I would try and keep the nowRail system simple. However, I've added some extra features. Now those features are the fact that I wanted to be able to set the volume or turn the volume on and off with a button. Now if you remember back going over to the webcam, I'd set up that button here on this WeAct module. Let's get back to the screen. Bringing the code for that button, that was on accessory number 4000. One of the things you can do within nowRail is you can set up your own custom functions. So what I've done in the custom functions, there is a function called nowAcconRec, and this is accessory commands that have been received by the board. And what I've done here is, if I get a value of 4000. If the value is greater than 0, so if it gets the 1 from the button, then what it will do is it will cause the board to play at the default volume of the board. That is the value that is stored here. Now, I could have just written in the value 27. I just wrote it this way because I know it is 27. The other thing that I've done is put in this little command here that just says that accessory 4000 has been received and has been processed. Now the opposite is if it gets a 0, it's going to set the volume to 0 and again send a response to say that it has been processed. So basically what we're doing is when that button is pressed, we are turning the volume on or off. So now you're going to get to hear my electric drill being turned on or off. So as you can see, very, very simple to create a system that turns the volume on or off. However, because this is going to be installed on my layout, one of the other things that I wanted was the ability to change the volume up or down in real time. Now that's because depending where your layout is, you might need the volume to be different. Now my layout is built for exhibitions, so when it's running in the garage and I'm the only one there, I don't need it to be very loud because there's just me in the garage. However, if it's in an exhibition hall that's absolutely huge, surrounded by people that are going to absorb sound, then it may be necessary to turn the sound up. So one of the things that I'm working on is just a simple sound controller. Now, one of the odd bits about nowRail, if I bring up that button system, you notice I can send the value of a button as 1 or 0. That's what would happen if you were doing it in DCC. However, I can also change it to a nowRail system where for accessory 4001 I can send a value of 20 or 0, and 20 when it is received on accessory 4001 will actually be the volume that is set. So instead of it turning the sound on or off as a 0 or 1, you can actually change the volume, and that will allow me, if you like, to have an increase volume and a decrease volume button on a separate control panel. So that is why I have this case 4001 within my sort of added, custom functions. So I think that is just about everything to do with the basics of setting up an MP3 player with nowRail. If you have any questions or you want to see more about how things are actually installed into the layout, please let me know. I'm thinking of doing a bit more of a series on the layout itself and how things are actually implemented for real rather than just on the breadboard. So if you've got any suggestions or questions, please stick them in the comments or contact me off the Digital Town website and I'll get back to you on that. Thanks for all the encouragement from those who've been using the system, and I will try and get some other features added soon. That's it for now though, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.